Hello and welcome to the Risen Jesus Podcast with Dr. Mike Licona. Dr. Licona is Associate Professor of Theology at Houston Baptist University, and he's a frequent speaker on university campuses, churches, retreats, and has appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. Mike is the president of Risen Jesus, a nonprofit organization. My name is Kurt Jaris, your host. On today's program, we're talking about the Apostolic Fathers and the evidence that they have for the fate of Jesus, specifically the death and resurrection of Jesus. But before we begin our conversation with Dr. Licona, be sure to subscribe to the channel and follow us on the Apple Podcast app or Google Play Store, however you may be listening to this program. That way you can get notifications about when new episodes are coming out. Well, Mike, on today's program, we're going to be talking about the Apostolic Fathers, and this is an area that I've enjoyed looking at for different reasons. I've read the Apostolic Fathers, looking for material on some theological beliefs they had, but you were looking at some of them for different reasons. What were those reasons specifically?
Well, I wanted to see what we could learn historically, if there was anything that would go back to Jesus' disciples, his apostles. Now, first of all, let's just say the name Apostolic Fathers can be somewhat confusing. We would think that that would be referring to the apostles themselves, but it's not. It's referring to those who came after the apostles, the leaders of the church who came after the apostles. So they call them the Apostolic Fathers, and some of them are believed to have had direct ties to the apostles. So what they say about Jesus can, look, if Mark is getting his information from Peter, then we should find it interesting if we got some valuable, if we have an apostolic father that got their information from one of the apostles, or at least knew one of the apostles and was affiliated with them and heard them speak. So that's what makes them interesting to me.
Yeah, that's great. You're right. I mean, if Peter, tradition says Peter was at Rome. I know some Protestants disagree with that, but if Peter had been at Rome, then there was some leader at the Church of Rome that took over after Peter, and who was that? And there must have been some connection there historically, and we can begin to look for the trails that go out throughout time. And so, so you looked at a number of these Christian leaders, and there's some debate over authenticity of the documents, and we'll get into that, and you'll talk about that with some of the early Christian writings. First, why don't we talk about Clement of Rome and what he may or may not provide for your project?
Sure. Well, Clement is, there are two letters that have been attributed to him, First Clement and Second Clement. It's scholars say that Second Clement was not written by that's pseudonymously attributed to Clement of Rome. So the question we start off with is, who was this Clement to whom the first Clement was attributed? Philippians chapter 4, verse 3 mentions a Clement by Paul, and Eusebius in the 4th century says that this Clement became Bishop of Rome. Now, whether Eusebius was correct, we can't say, but we can see that Eusebius was saying that this Clement that Paul mentioned in Philippians became a bishop of Rome. And then later on, you've got Irenaeus. Again, he's writing somewhere between 174 and 189. He mentions a Clement who became the 3rd bishop of Rome. And he said that this Clement had conversed with and had seen the apostles. And then Irenaeus also says that First Clement was written by the church in Rome while Clement was the bishop there, and that he wrote this to the church, or that church wrote it to the church in Corinth. So that's pretty interesting, to have that. So we've got Eusebius and Irenaeus that's talking about this Clement who was a bishop in Rome, and Eusebius says that this is the same Clement that Paul mentions in Philippians chapter 4. And you've got Irenaeus who says that this Clement was there in the Church of Rome. He was bishop there when First Clement was written by that church. And then you have Dionysius, who was the bishop of Corinth. And he wrote a letter to the bishop of the church at Rome, whose name was Soter. Soter means savior. So he wrote a letter to the bishop there in Rome, somewhere between the years 166 and 174. And he acknowledges, in that letter, he acknowledges receiving a letter from Soter that he had written to the church at Corinth. So the bishop of the church at Rome writing to the bishop, writing to the church at Corinth. The bishop of the church at Corinth is saying this. And he says it was just read at one of their worship services. And he tells Soter that he believes that this letter that he wrote will be as helpful to them there in Corinth as the earlier letter that was written through Clement was, that was also written to the church at Corinth. So, and Eusebius is the one who mentions this letter by Dionysius. So this is pretty cool. It seems to be some decent evidence that Clement was the bishop of Rome and that this letter written while he was bishop there, while Clement was written there, was written to the church at Corinth. That seems to corroborate the story that's mentioned by Irenaeus. Later on, you've got Tertullian, I'm guessing around the year 200, and he says Clement was ordained by Peter for the church in Rome. And then you've got Clement of Alexandria, another Clement, but a later one, also around the year 200, says that First Clement was written by the Apostle Clement. You have in the letters of Ignatius, specifically his letter to the Trallians, you have what's called a longer recension. And it's probably not part of the original Ignatius letter to the Trallians. It came later. But in that longer recension, it says that Clement was a helper of Peter. So you've got all these early church fathers. And even if this longer recension isn't part of Ignatius's, the authentic letter of Ignatius to the Trallians, it does show that there was a tradition going around whenever it was written that linked Peter and Clement of Rome. So you've got this unanimous testimony that kind of links this Clement of Rome, who was bishop of Rome, to First Clement. And one of these links it to the Clement mentioned in Philippians by Paul, and and others say that this Clement was linked, associated with Peter. So that's pretty strong. It's not, of course, it's not airtight because it comes from later sources, but it does show that there was a widespread, long-standing tradition that links the author of First Clement to be affiliated with Peter.
Yeah. So tell us about the evidence, the data here then in First Clement. What does Clement say about the fate of Jesus?
Yeah, well, first you have, I think it's chapter 5 where he talks about Peter and Paul, and it's either 5 or 42. Sometimes I get these mixed up, but let's just call it chapter 5. He places Paul on par with his mentor Peter, okay? And he says that both of these, he's using some language where he says they suffered, I believe, unto death. Heos thanatu. They struggled unto death. And so were they being persecuted to the point of dying, but not dying, but were they martyred? And it's hard to tell, but heos thanatu doesn't necessarily mean martyrdom, because Jesus suffered unto death while in the garden, and he didn't die at that point.
I see.
But it seems that the language that Clement uses there in chapter 5 would seem to suggest that that Peter and Paul were martyred for their belief. So here we've got an early testimony from First Clement that Peter was martyred, that Paul was martyred. You also have John chapter 21, of course, that alludes to the martyrdom of Peter. John's written in the 1st century and would be after the event, of course. So even if you deny that John wrote the gospel attributed to him, we still have this tradition of Peter being martyred by crucifixion in John chapter 21, which is pretty interesting. Still, first century testimony. So that's what you have. And then I believe it's chapter 42. It says that the disciples were encouraged when they saw Jesus risen from the dead and when he spent time with them. So yeah, it becomes important in that way. And what I like about First Clement as well, not only does it seem more probable than not that the author was Clement, the Bishop of Rome, who was associated, who knew the Apostle Peter, but there are various dates of composition here. You've got a later dating, which is somewhere between the years 95 and 97, and then you have an early dating, which is in the 60s. And it's hard to choose between these two. So I kind of lean toward the late 60s, but it could be there in the mid 90s. But if it's the late 60s, that'd be pretty cool. I mean, you've got First Clement chapters 40 and 41 that speak of the Jerusalem temple is still standing and that ritual practices are still going on. It's the present tense, which would place this prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem temple. But then in just a couple chapters after that, it mentions leaders in the church who were twice removed from the apostles. So you can still get there if some of them died or were imprisoned. That's possible. But it's still a decent argument for a later dating of First Clement. So it's kind of hard to tell. But even if it's a late dating, you still have Clement, who appears to have been the bishop of the church in Rome at that point, and he had known the Apostle Peter. That seems more probable than not in my estimation. And so therefore, what First Clement includes in it would be compatible, or at least some of it, with the death and resurrection of Jesus, would seem to be compatible with what was known, what Clement would have received from Peter.
Yeah. In your book, you give it a possible plus rating. So it's not merely possible. Here you're saying, man, the evidence is good that this is valuable material here to be weighed. And of course, in the forthcoming seasons, we'll be getting into the specifics and sort of coming back to these ideas that we find in these historical sources. But first, we need to figure out the lay of the land on what sources are good and valuable and fit within the framework of your project here.
Yeah, it's like with First Clement. It based on the data that we have, it's a little bit stronger than saying it's possible. The probabilities, it's a little more probable than just saying it's possible. That's how I would rate it.
Yeah, good. All right, let's move along to Polycarp. Tell me about, that's kind of a fun name, Polycarp.
It
tell
is.
Me about him.
I like that name, Polycarp. But it's something, I've been to Indonesia twice, and there's a guy that was in Indonesia in the past. He's dead now. And I never met him. I don't even know when this was, but he was a villain over there, a bad guy named Polycarp. So when you mentioned Polycarp, I figured this was just an ancient name, but no, there's someone far more recent named Polycarp who has a very bad reputation in Indonesia. But Polycarp, you've got more, Bart Ehrman has said that there's been more written about Polycarp than any other of the apostolic fathers. We have a letter that was written to him by Ignatius, who's probably writing in the first decade of the 2nd century. You have a letter written about Polycarp, specifically his martyrdom. It's called the Martyrdom of Polycarp, written probably around the middle of the 2nd century. And then you have a letter written by Polycarp that he wrote to the church at Philippi. So from these, we can learn quite a bit about it. Irenaeus says that Polycarp had been instructed by the apostles, especially John the son of Zebedee, and he had spoke with others who had seen Jesus. Irenaeus also says that when Irenaeus was younger, he actually saw and heard Polycarp speak about Jesus's miracles and his teachings, and what he had heard from Polycarp. He remembered Polycarp was sharing what he had learned from the apostles and those who had handed down the traditions about Jesus. So that's pretty cool. The problem is that what we know about Polycarp in this way we only get from Irenaeus. So was Irenaeus giving us trustworthy information? Well, we don't have good reasons for doubting Irenaeus, but we don't necessarily have positive reasons for it. So it's a matter of whether we trust Irenaeus on this. And yeah, of course, as Christians, we may be inclined to want to trust him, but just because we want to trust him doesn't mean that we should. So I just listed Polycarp as a source, his letter to the church at Philippi, as possible. But he also mentions Jesus' resurrection in here. So if he's getting this, if he had known about this from the Apostle John or from other apostles or eyewitnesses that he had met, then that's pretty valuable information, it would seem. He's just one removed from the apostles. So that's pretty cool if that's the case. The problem, the challenge is that we can only have so much confidence in that. So that's why I just rated him as possible.
Yep. All right, now the next one is a possible minus, and it's about the letter of Barnabas. So tell me about the letter of Barnabas.
Well, the letter of Barnabas, this is not to be confused with the Gospel of Barnabas, which the one that we have today was almost certainly a medieval forgery, probably written in the 15th century. And I've got a video of that on my YouTube channel if anybody's interested. What are we to think about the Gospel of Barnabas? There was another Gospel of Barnabas, though. I think you have what's called the Gelasian Decree. I don't remember when it was, 5th or 7th century, and that mentions a Gospel of Barnabas, which is no doubt different than the Gospel of Barnabas that was the Muslim forgery. But even then, the Gelasian Decree says it's a spurious document. It's a spurious piece of literature, not written by the actual Barnabas, the apostle. But the letter of Barnabas is different, and that's part of the Apostolic Fathers. It mentions the destruction of the temple and that plans were presently in place to build a new one. And so that places this letter, dates it sometime after the year 70 and perhaps before the year 130, but we're not certain. It's just certain after the year 70. Interestingly is that Clement of Alexandria, Didymus the Blind in the mid-4th century, you have Origen a little before then, sometime in the 3rd century, and even Jerome in the late 4th, sometime between the late 4th and early 5th century, they attribute this letter to the apostle Barnabas, who had been the traveling companion of Paul. But today it's virtually universally rejected by scholars. Even Eusebius in the 4th century said it was spurious. So it wasn't unanimous that this was written by Barnabas. But most scholars today reject it as being written by Barnabas because the content regarding the Jewish law in it differs from Paul's, for one. And according to Galatians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, what you have is Barnabas there in Galatians at that time, around the early 50s. Barnabas had a tendency to keep the Jewish law. Whereas in the letter, you have Barnabas had a hostile attitude toward the law's literal interpretation. So we have a different Barnabas, sounding Barnabas, in the letter of Barnabas than we have in the Barnabas in the Galatians letter that Paul wrote. However, we have to acknowledge that this letter was written at least 15 years after Galatians was written, and probably more than 20 years after the Jerusalem Council, which is plenty of time that Barnabas would have had to mull over these issues. Paul is dead at this point. He has been influenced by Paul. He's seen things like Peter having his vision, saying when God communicates to him that it's fine for the Gentiles to become part of God's family here with the gospel. So they see some of Jesus' teachings. They know of Peter's vision. They know Paul has been preaching to the Gentiles. So Barnabas could certainly have evolved in his views, and it's possible that this is a letter, an authentic letter from Barnabas. We just can't know. Most scholars don't think so. And there's really nothing in here on the resurrection of Jesus. So it's really not useful. But even it being an authentic letter, I just rated it as possible minus.
Yeah, it's kind of fun to jump into early Christian history, looking at, for example, if the letter of Barnabas were authentic, or even First Clement, or Polycarp, that material, to see what early Christians thought about there beyond the age of the apostles, the second order, third order in the first century. It's fascinating to see where the church is at, the issues that they're dealing with, and for me, I enjoy even reading on and on throughout the centuries of the first 5 or 6 centuries. So let me ask you sort of a listener viewer question from me then.
By the way, let me just say one more thing here, and that is we can revisit Tom Wright's observation about how some rather skeptical scholars like to see things in earlier recensions of Q or earlier editions of the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Thomas, but they don't like to talk about reconstructing Mark's lost ending, or what about that pseudo-Mark ending? Where did that come from? Did that come from a lost gospel? Here they like to go with these things like earlier recensions of Q, or these hypothetical sources like a cross gospel, but yet we've got First Clement and Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, that really the evidence that they have links to the apostles Peter and John respectively are far greater than any kind of arguments that are being proposed for earlier recensions of Q, or a cross gospel and things like that. And yet those same scholars who want to go with those things, they don't touch these things like First Clement or Polycarp's letter to the church at Philippi, which I think it's a lot more likely that we're going to find something good in those.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, well, let me ask you, so as a listener question from me this week, since we've jumped into sort of some of my territory on apostolic fathers, and then a little bit broader, the church fathers. If you had to pick one church father that you enjoy reading the most, which one would it be?
Well, since the apostolic fathers are, they belong in the writings of the early church fathers, boy, it's hard to choose. I like First Clement, I like Clement of Rome, and I like Polycarp. Choosing between the two of them, it's hard. That's difficult. Gosh, the chances that Clement was affiliated with Peter and Polycarp affiliated with John, it's pretty cool. And then, something we didn't cover here would be the fragments of Papias, who's early 2nd century. And, we didn't cover him because I don't cover him in the book, because he doesn't say anything in reference to the death or resurrection of Jesus, or the resurrection of Jesus. So, but boy, if we had those lost writings of Papias, for which we only have fragments that have survived, that'd be pretty cool. I mean, it's hard to choose between those. I mean, even Ignatius, he doesn't have the ties to the apostles that that Clement and Polycarp would have had, but he knew Polycarp and he wrote a letter to him. So
yeah, he was at Antioch.
Wow, be awesome to have been able to sit down and talk with these guys. I wish we had more from them.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of good figures in early Christian history. And like I said, it's sort of great to explore and see what the early church was dealing with outside, beyond the time frame of the canon, if you will. So mid to late 1st century, maybe even early 2nd century, the issues they're dealing with and thinking about. It's always fun to see the state of the church that early in Christian history. Yeah. Good. Well, Mike, thanks for cluing us in here about a few of these apostolic fathers and the evidence that they bear for the fate of Jesus. I look forward to next week's discussion as we begin looking at non-canonical Christian literature. All right, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us on Apple Podcasts and the Google Play Store. We look forward to seeing you next week.